How does long-term stress impact your breathing? Today's session, we're going to be talking about the stress continuum in terms of going from a position of someone who's like anxious and panicky all the way to someone who potentially is struggling with chronic fatigue, and how that continual exposure to stress impacts both our physiology, our breathing, and potentially things like our whole mind-body connection, hormonal systems, immune systems, even down to the genetics. So we're going to be going through things like allostasis, allostatic load. What do they mean? But first of all, I want to kind of like take us through a little bit of the stress recovery relationship and the four considerations that we can kind of make here. The first one being that we can have things like acute fatigue. You might train at a gym, or you might have a long day at work where you finish at maybe 9 p.m. at night time and your sleep's disrupted because you're feeling, a little bit overwhelmed. You can hear yourself breathing heavy, heart racing at night time, and you just don't get the best quality sleep. So the following day, you feel tired. Yeah. You might feel a little bit achy. You might feel, if you've been in the gym, you're a little bit sore. But if you're just generally working too hard, you might just feel like you've got a little bit of a headache. But within 24 hours, you recover. And in fact, if you recover well, you might even next time have created an adaptation so that you're better. Your performance increases. Actually, you don't get that same response as you did before, particularly if you do this, obviously, long term with the adequate recovery. Now, the next thing you want to consider is what we call functional overreaching. This would be like a training program in the gym, or if you were to go and learn a particular new skill set, say you're a software developer and you had a new piece of software that you're designing and you're engineering, and that just happens to lead to having to spend long hours trying to figure it out. But by the time of 6 or 8 weeks later, you're noticing you're fatigued, your performance levels are starting to decline, so you step back. Now, you take a week to recover, you go on holiday, or you take a deload week in the gym. And when you come back, it's like, wow, actually, it's much easier now. I feel as if I'm improved. There's a super compensation, both physically, mentally, and maybe even emotionally, and you're able to perform better next time. That means that the stress and recovery was adequate. However, if we go to non-functional overreaching, what we're now doing is we're in a position where the stress period is too long. Yeah, maybe in a fight camp, someone was training for 6 to 8 weeks for a fight camp, but in fact, the fight got delayed or something happened and they continue to train. And then it turns out it ended up training for 12 weeks. And at that point, they're feeling really, really tired and fatigued. And it takes maybe weeks or months to recover. But when they do recover and they come back, there hasn't been an improvement in performance. It's not functional anymore. And then there is overtraining, or we could say even burnout. And this is where the stress period has been so long that there's been a shift. There's been a significant shift in our nervous system, our hormonal system, our immune system, and gone to a point what we'd call a change in our allostatic load. So homeostasis is returning back to the normal position. Allostasis is getting an adaptation. Now, we improve, we get bigger, we get stronger. But when we have an allostatic load, what we're then going is we're going into what would be like a red zone with stress. And the nervous system itself has updated its model of the world. So now what's going on in our physiology, there's been a complete shift in that things like excessive sympathetic activity will be occurring, and it will continue to stay risen. I will put a diagram up here now showing the difference between when a sympathetic activity comes back down and sympathetic activity rises. What will that mean? Well, excessive noradrenaline in the body, excessive norepinephrine in the body. Why? Because the body is always trying to predict what's coming next. If you don't return to homeostasis over and over again, it's going to change the way that it works to conserve energy in the shifts it has to make. However, when we actually start to look at burnout, burnout seems to be this position where there's a shift in that a person goes from being, you could say, hyperarousal, feeling irritated, feeling unable to sleep, feeling as if they have excessive energy and feeling like they're stressed and heart racing, to then starting to come back to a decline again and starting to go shifting towards more hypoarousal, feeling fatigued, lethargic, depressed. That means that now we've had a change. We've had a dysfunction starting to occur in the body, and allostatic overload is starting to change now how mitochondria can even function. So mitochondria are building blocks for our ATP, the universal energy molecule. It's what provides energy for everything in our cells. So in a stress response, it's what provides energy for a shift in our sympathetic activity. But if that mitochondria now is dysfunctional and it can no longer provide the activity for the stress response in a position of burnout, we start to then have inadequate energy for the level of stress that the individual's under. We now have a maladaptation. In the immune system, this might show up as excessive chronic inflammation. Rather than having an anti-inflammatory impact with our parasympathetic activity, we're now seeing excessive inflammation, which might lead to things like insulin sensitivity, risk of type 2 diabetes, leptin resistance, with risk of obesity and sleep apnea. So what does that do to everyday breathing? Well, this study here was a study that looked at trying to demonstrate what happens in this continuum to respiratory drive. Now, respiratory drive, we could consider that as breath rate, breath depth, and the force that the generation force of our diaphragm. So how forceful is breathing? That was going to contribute to obviously an increase in volume. So initially, this study was going to look at doing what we'd call a hyperventilation provocation test, where we get someone for 60 seconds to breathe as hard as they can, and we measure the lowest level of CO2. However, because you can see here, individuals, even at resting, in anticipation a hyperventilation test was going to come, they started to overbreathe and CO2 levels started to drop. So they said, well, in this case, the hyperventilation provocation test might not be a valuable thing to do. It might be excessive. So they decided to just do 5 size. Simply in their own time, all they had to do is go, there was no rush. Just they said when they feel like it, whenever they want to, they can do that. And they measured the lowest level of carbon dioxide as a measure of respiratory drive. In that someone who is relaxed, they might just sigh and go, someone who's anxious might go, someone who's overtrained might go, you can see how there's a difference in the size of the sigh to offload that stress. Now, if we look at what happens with the lowest level of CO2, with the lowest level of CO2 being the point at which where someone's overtraining, and now there's a shift where burnout and in chronic fatigue starts to come back down again. It's almost as respiratory drive reduces once we get into a position of burnout. And that's what I'm talking about when I was discussing allostatic overload. There's a point where someone goes through a hyperarousal to potentially hypoarousal, and that's going to change behavior from being more aggressive, from being more reactive, from being more, you could say, like on the go all the time, to feeling depressed, to feeling lethargic, not wanting to get out of bed, to mentally having negative thoughts. Now, the driver of this is obviously the ability to produce energy coming down from our metabolic system. Now, the metabolic system is obviously definitely, it's directly tied to our breathing. So what we have to consider here is we have to consider catching hyperventilation early by measuring things like respiratory rate, by measuring things potentially if we have opportunity to look at things like capnography and measuring CO2 levels when people are resting, even when people are under stress. We need to be observing people's breathing patterns. These things are telling us through an individual's behavior, in fact, they're driving an individual's behavior, what is going on. And by making those observations, we can clearly see when a person's in a position when they are starting to create what we'd call a shift in allostatic load. And therefore, we're in a position where actually this person's putting themselves at risk of chronic disease, mental health issues, burnout, and I hate to say it, but even the final thing might even be suicide. That's right. I think there is a burden on people to feel as if they are so stressed and so overwhelmed, particularly males who cannot speak about it because they have things like anxiety, stress, worry, responsibilities. Society has produced things like you can get millions of dollars on a loan that you have to pay off. And what happens if you lose your job? You might have 2, 3, 4 children and a wife. You might have car loans, bills to pay. However, the responsibility for people to then bring in that financial need to meet the demands of what society is making people play eventually might lead to people feeling shameful and having issues being able to talk. And the final result of this is suicide. This is why it's so crucial for us to be able to manage stress effectively, to understand ourselves, to pay attention to our breathing, to sleep well, to be able to communicate. Communication, language is the vibration of your physiology. Pay attention to people's language and pay attention to people's behavior and breathing, and it will give you the signs. Look, I hope this helped you. There's obviously a clear message in this that I would love for people to spread. The only way that I can get this message spread is by getting this video out there. Now, I don't expect people to share this. However, if you do have a comment, a question, like or a subscribe, this just helps the channel grow. It helps me to push more information out there. I'm going to continue to post on this social media, this YouTube channel. And, I would welcome your support. Thank you.